Climate change has been identified as a leading human and environmental crisis of the 21st century. The problem of understanding climate change, or that of global warming, is one of the major challenges confronting African people, their governments, and the African Union. Despite contributing only a minor portion of global greenhouse gas emissions, the African continent suffers the deleterious effect of climate change to disproportionate degree. Climate change is endangering the lives and livelihoods of more than 100 million people living in extreme poverty. The economic development of Africa depends on a number of industries, including agriculture. The changing climate could lead to local markets to become unstable, which might increase food insecurity, delay economic growth, and increase risk of agriculture investment. African agriculture is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because it is heavily dependent on rainfall. And climate change has seriously affected rainfall throughout the continent. Another factor putting Africa at risk as a result of climate change is the shrinking of carbon sinks. Every year, the Congo Basin loses an estimated 500,000 to 1.2 million hectares of tropical rainforest, reducing the world's second-largest historical carbon sink and a critical means of mitigating the effect of global warming. Furthermore, due to water constraint, Africa faces an increased chance of 3 to 4 year droughts. Since the 1960s, climate change has slowed agricultural production growth in Africa by 34%, more than in any other region. Climate change has serious implications for biodiversity, animal husbandry, productivity, and human health and well-being. At a global warming level of 2 degrees Celsius, West Africa is projected to lose 42% of rangeland and livestock productivity by mid-century. Certain crops and animal husbandry sectors face collapse in some parts of the continent. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projects that above global warming level 1.5 degrees Celsius, half of assessed species in Africa will lose over 30% of their population or area of suitable habitat. At a global warming level 2 degrees Celsius, 12% of African species assessed are at risk of global extinction, placing Africa second only to South America in the magnitude of anticipated biodiversity losses. 36% of freshwater fish species on the continent are vulnerable to local extinction. 20% of North African mammals may lose suitable climates. By mid-century, the World Bank predicts 19 million people in North Africa and 86 million in Sub-Saharan Africa could become internal migrants due to climate shocks that affect their homes, livelihoods, such as devastating storms, flooding, and prolonged heat waves and droughts. Decreased rainfall, evaporation of lakes, and land degradation have hurt traditional source of livelihood and contributed to breakdown of local economies. All of this impacts Africa, which has made a little contribution to the problem. According to the UN, international finance flowing to developing countries for climate adaptation program is 5 to 10 times lower than what is needed. And the gap is widening. Developing countries' annual climate adaptation needs are expected to increase to $160 up to $340 billion by 2030 and to $350 up to $565 billion by 2050. The International Climate Conference in Egypt ended with a long-awaited deal on a loss and damage fund for channeling finance to developing countries and new pledge to the Adaptation Fund. While these are positive developments, they do not constitute an immediate flow of finance to the most vulnerable states, especially taking into account the target which developed countries missed of mobilizing $100 billion a year by 2020. The upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP28, should specifically address the climate change impact on Africa, or failing that, the African Union should call for an African-specific conference to address this issue. The money pledged for climate change in Africa countries must be implemented. The heavy carbon emitters like China and the United States have a moral obligation to help the nations of Africa, particularly the rural areas of these countries, and mitigate the impact of climate change, not just to help Africa, but to help the rest of the world.